Today, we'll be looking at Flight 242 and the rare insight that this nightmare flight gave us to improve the powerful turbo engines that so many of our passenger aircraft use to carry us across the oceans and continents. But 242 did more than that. So much more. This fated flight was taken hostage by Mother Nature, and on that day in 1977, her wrath wasn't just restricted to the skies and the bodies flying in it. She took her anger out on the heavens and the earth, leaving behind a trail of destruction that humans and our technology can't even begin to compete with. We've covered a lot of tragic events on this channel, but few come close to that of Flight 242, and rarely do we have so many eyewitnesses' accounts to paint the horrifying and utterly devastating events that transpired on that day. And as we always do, we start with the aeroplane itself and work our way through to the horrific final event that brought the hardened military men flying Flight 242 into a battle with the forces of nature, and one like they'd never experienced in all of the war zones they faced on the ground. The McDonnell Douglas DC-931 was introduced in the 60s, specifically for short domestic flights. Unlike the bigger aircraft designed to carry 300 or more passengers across the oceans, the DC can hold only 139 passengers, not including the crew. Engines are situated at the back, straddling the tail. Most of the time, passenger plane engines are placed on the wings, but since the DC-931 is a little more compact, the amount of noise that would infiltrate the body of the plane would be immense, and this back-end thrust actually increases aerodynamics for a plane of this size and shape. It's the ideal design for these quick flights that have to navigate shorter runways, and it's had a pretty good track record in the air since its release. It's not exactly made to withstand extreme conditions like the big passenger Boeings and Airbuses with all of their autopilot features and sensors, but the DC just doesn't need to have all of these features if it's just spending a few hours in the air at a time. Flight 424 didn't have many issues during its tenure for the airport. Besides its annual maintenance checks and minor repairs, it was a pretty unproblematic and reliable machine overall. There are some considerations to take into account with the DC-9, however, especially back in the 70s, simply because the safety standards and required alterations were much different than it is now. For one, the weather radars in use at the time had limitations, especially in weather where there was more than the usual amount of water in the air. If the plane went into an area with particularly heavy precipitation, this could cause weakening of the radar signal, or in some circumstances, complete loss of information of significant weather conditions. It also couldn't identify accurately just how much precipitation was in the air ahead, just that there was more water than usual. So the pilots just didn't have enough information to know that it was time to navigate around or under such areas. The radar only showed areas highlighted in white to indicate where there was more water than usual, and the dark areas were low in precipitation. Unfortunately, if there's a wide surface area affected by heavy rains, miles upon miles on the radar screen just looks like one massive white patch. Trying to find which areas are less affected than others becomes very difficult to determine so that a plane can be rerouted to avoid the most affected airspaces. Normally, radar sends out signals, and those waves hit the clouds and bounce back to the plane to report their findings on the screen. But in conditions where precipitation is unusually high, like they would be around hurricanes and tornadoes, the signal deflects off the clouds at an angle, simply because the air is too thick to penetrate accurately, and the water causes a refraction bend to occur. The same way an object looks different in dimensions and distance underwater that it would out in the open air. This effect then sends back completely false information, pinpointing openings in the storm that don't exist. If anything, those dark areas that should indicate safety are more congested with precipitation than their surroundings. The radar just couldn't penetrate the clouds to tell the screen that it's feeding information to. The airline did make this limitation a part of its regular training, so both Kiel and McKenzie were aware of it. Usually, in the event that the weather radars malfunction, it's simply a matter of waiting a few minutes for the plane to pass through the heavy rainfall cloud, and the system would go back to functioning normally. Or they'd look for a location on the screen where the white pixels were the least. And since the DC-9 flew at slightly lower altitudes, statistically speaking, the chances of encountering the amount of precipitation that would severely impact the radars was incredibly unlikely. But as we'd soon find out, the weather wasn't exactly ordinary on that day. And since we're on the subject of unusual weather and the systems that weren't quite as equipped to deal with them as they should have been, we need to look at the turbine engines too. Turbine engines simply aren't tolerant of extreme weather conditions, especially not when rain, hail and wind are involved in the equation. But back in the 70s, this information wasn't known. Of all of the test flights and service histories, there just wasn't any problematic results or reports yet that would indicate further investigation. The events of Flight 242 would go a long way to change that though, so there is a silver lining to this enormous tragedy at least. The turbine engine that 242 had installed was called the JT-8D, and they run at relatively high engine rotation speeds, especially during descent and approach. Today's models are designed to automatically switch the engine over to idle for long periods during descent in order to be more fuel efficient. But since JT-8D engines operate closer to their surge line, that's when the airflow coming through the engine becomes a little unstable. Pilots have to keep their engine's operation in mind at all times, and none more so than during descent to keep the plane stable. Given that airflow on its own can already cause instability, adding excess amounts of water to a descent just complicates matters even more. Running at this high level of rotation speed means that the engine is running at almost full capacity. It's just not capable of taking on much more intense levels of strain than they are already dealing with. If all that sounds scary, rest assured that the technology has changed a great deal since then, and engines, sensors, and radar are all better equipped to deal with and to spot bad weather. But back then, especially on shorter flights, these considerations were just not on the table at the time, because the world of aviation hadn't dealt with such problems enough to warrant any suspicions yet. With that said, let's move on to the pilots and the crew on board 242, shall we? Captain William W. Mackenzie, who everyone just referred to as Bill, was 54 years old with 19,380 flight hours under his belt, 3,205 of those hours being behind the yoke of the DC-9. After high school, Mackenzie joined the Army and piloted aircraft both on and off the battlefield. When he retired from the military at the age of 28, he was already a seasoned veteran in the air. Almost as soon as he stepped out of the service, he was employed by Southwest Airlines. And who could blame them for jumping on the opportunity to get their hands on such a decorated pilot? His 26 years flying civilian flights was as good a service history as the aircraft he was manning on that day had. Layman W. Keeley Jr. was 34 years old and had 3,878 logged hours, with 234 of them on the DC-9. And if you thought Mackenzie's record was good, it almost paled in comparison to Keeley's. Also, a military veteran, Keeley was considered to be a bit of a wonder kid in the field of military aviation. Serving for the Navy, he flew more than 100 combat missions in Vietnam, not to mention a few hundred more hours on other missions on and off combat zones. To say that he could keep his cool in unpredictable and deadly circumstances would be an understatement. He'd been at the airline for about 4 years, and as you'd expect, had a clean record. No complaints and no incident reports during his time at Southwest Airline. The flight between Northwest Alabama Regional Airport to Hartsfield Atlanta International Airport is a short one, only 52 minutes for takeoff to landing. This flight was going to take a few minutes longer, however, since they were scheduled for a short stopover at Huntsville-Madison County Jetport to pick up more passengers. The pilots manning the plane that day had made 13 flights already, circling the southern states of the US. Every stop was a perpetual loop of loading, unloading, refueling, and rising back into the skies again. On the 14th time that they took off from the ground at Northwest Alabama Airport, there were 81 people on board, with the rest waiting to be picked up at Huntsville-Madison. Since the flight wasn't at full capacity and it was taking place later in the afternoon, they weren't going to be any meals served during the flight. So only 2 flight attendants were booked to take care of the passengers. They were 26-year-old Catherine Lemoyne Cooper and 24-year-old Sandy Pearl. The weather had started off fairly well that morning, with sunny skies punctuated with only a few clouds. But as the day progressed, the sunshine turned into a light drizzle, and the closer it got to Alabama, the heavier the rain and the wind became. Later we learned just how severe the weather really was. Captain Bill Mackenzie and his co-pilot arrived from Atlanta just an hour before taking to the skies again, and that last flight was so turbulent that he ordered that everyone remain in their seats and that they be buckled up tight. Catherine and Sandy were told that the weather probably wasn't going to improve. If anything, they could expect it to get worse. The stewardess were prepared to settle any nervous flyers, but unless a passenger absolutely needed their assistance, they were to remain seated too, with their safety belts fastened just like everyone else. Both the pilots and the attendants were eager to get this day over with. If everything went as planned, they'd land in Hartsfield, Atlanta in 25 minutes, do 2 more landings, and finally call it a day before 6 o'clock that evening. Right before their scheduled takeoff at 3:50 p.m., the Huntsville Weather Control reports to the airline that they see moderate to heavy precipitation conditions forming over the area where 242 is about to fly over. According to their radar readings, the conditions are perfect for tornadoes to form, and at the very least, thunder and thick rain conditions are to be expected. Before we go on, let's get something clear. The reality of tornadoes isn't what the movies depict. A tornado doesn't form in the heart of the storm, with all the wind converging on one gigantic twister that rages across the land, leaving a single trail of destruction behind. No. More often than not, there are dozens of smaller tornadoes miles away from each other, forming wherever the conditions allow them to. Tornadoes aren't the only thing out there that you need to worry about either. Hail, rain, mist, clouds so thick that it's almost completely dark. And to top it off, air so cold that minuscule ice particles freeze over the sensors or solidify on the body of the plane, weighing it down with so much weight that it can overload an aircraft in minutes. If ever war could be compared to piloting a passenger aircraft, it would be in these horrendous conditions. The day after Flight 242's unfortunate takeoff, we learned that the National Weather Service reported that April 4th, 1977 had some of the most severe weather ever recorded in northeast Alabama and northwestern Georgia's history. In the wider area, there were no less than 20 tornadoes and 30 severe thunderstorms recorded during that time. But the airports and the Huntsville weather station weren't aware of just how much the storms were building in severity. Still, the weather station was concerned enough to request to be put through to the pilot of Flight 242, hoping to stall the takeoff for a few minutes to monitor the situation. But Mackenzie and Keeley already had their vessel off the runway and into the stormy sky. They couldn't turn back now. Just as 242 reached a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, they're hit with a tremendous amount of turbulence, enough to turn the stomachs of even the most seasoned flyers. Captain Mackenzie agrees with the station operator that they need to find a route of clearer sky between the storms. It's Keeley who sees a dark spot on the radar first, indicating that there's an area ahead with less precipitation, and hopefully some respite from the unending flashes of lightning and constant battering of hail and sleet that's shaking the craft. Both Mackenzie and the operator on the radio agree that this is the safest route to take, and it would only take them a few minutes out of their scheduled flight path. Neither air traffic control nor the pilots realize that the dark spot is not an opening at all. The radar signals couldn't penetrate the heavy clouds, and it sent back faulty information. In reality, that area is thicker in precipitation than anywhere else on the screen. So Mackenzie and Keeley directed the plane to that single black spot on the radar, but almost as soon as they took the turn, radar signals came back with the right information and the entire screen went white. They've flown straight into the heart of the storm, and the results of this decision become immediately apparent. The sound of hail slamming against the plane was described as being in a metal barrel while being pelted with rocks. The noise was so deafening that the pilots were shouting to hear each other over the din. And that shouldn't be surprising. The balls of hail were striking the metal hull, were as big as apples. When the power shuts off and the only light is coming from the dark grey storm outside, which isn't much. It could be from being struck by lightning or severe icing in the freezing temperatures at that altitude. Our most likely turbine engines are starting to suffer under the strain of hail hitting the fans. It's impossible to tell what exactly caused the outage. With all the chaotic noise going on, no one could discern anymore what was hail and what was thunder. Keeley now had to keep the plane steady using only the horizon for context. Had this been a normal day, that shouldn't have been a problem. He'd done it a million times during his years in the army, but the storm outside made that impossible. Everything just looked like a sea of deep grey, with only the rain, hail and lightning punctuating the solid mass of near-complete darkness in front of them. In these terrible visual conditions, Keeley wanted to drop their height down to an altitude of 14,000 feet, hoping to get under the storm clouds and out of the hail. With the power going out, so did the radio, as Atlanta Air Traffic Control was about to find out. At 4:10 p.m. they tried to reach the plane to find their location, because by now every airstrip in the affected area was checking on every body they had in the sky. But the line to 242 was only giving static. Mackenzie and Keeley were on their own, so they began the descent without getting clearance from control. They'd been so intent on getting themselves out of the situation that neither pilot thought to brief the stewardess on the declining situation. Catherine defies instruction and unbuckles the seatbelt. She goes to the cockpit to get an update from the captain, and to her horror she finds the two men shouting over their radios and fiddling with dials. Mackenzie tells her shortly to get back to her seat. Catherine turns back to her station, but the fear in Mackenzie's voice and the sight of the cracks forming in the cockpit windshield from the hail striking it is enough to confirm that the situation is much more dire than they thought. Catherine and Sandy, with no answers from the pilots, are forced to take matters into their own hands. In order to calm the passengers who are by now on the verge of panic, instead of soothing them with empty words, they begin to instruct them on emergency landing procedures. A sense of focused calm that the stewardesses are emanating appears in the passengers too. They don't need the captain to tell them that this is a dire situation. The plane's violent shaking and the deafening barrage of hail that's coming from all sides is proof enough that Flight 242 is in trouble. That much is crystal clear. After 39 seconds, the power comes back on. Catherine and Sandy continue their instructions without missing a beat. And finally, Atlanta Air Traffic Control gets through to the cockpit. With their systems now back on, Keeley sees that he's gotten the plane down to 17,000 feet and informs Control that he's already in the process of going down to 14,000 feet to get under the clouds. They approve the request, even though Keeley's already in a slight dive. In the next 30 seconds, a lot of things start to happen. Keeley and Mackenzie are fighting against Mother Nature's forces to get beneath the storm. Sandy and Catherine have the passengers' full attention as they shout emergency procedures over the noise, and a passenger named Don Foster happens to catch sight of something outside the window. He can see the hail striking the plane, leaving baseball-sized dents in the metal of the wing. And from his close proximity, he can hear the frozen missiles hit the engine too. The engine begins to whine and backfire. These ice bullets are quite literally ripping the innards of that engine into pieces. Predictably, the engine sputters to a halt in a shower of sparks. The turbo engine just wasn't made to withstand this kind of stress. Then the hail cracks the cockpit window. After being hit hundreds of times, that one final blow sent spiderwebs of fractures across the entire surface of the glass. Any second now, that thing is going to explode inward, shattering to Keeley and Mackenzie's faces. The final nail in the coffin strikes 242. The right engine blows out too, and with it the power, radio, and hydraulics go down. Immediately the plane begins to lose altitude. They're heading to the ground at 56 feet per second now. Atlanta receives the transmission from Mackenzie that the first engine failed, and when the line goes dead, they can only assume that the other engine stopped working too. The flight controllers on the ground are beginning to panic, but that's not the case inside 242. In darkness, the passengers have already prepared as best as they could for a crash. Strangers hold hands and pray, and loved ones tell each other that it's all going to be okay. The stewardesses keep the stream of instructions going, and the pilots' years of military training are showing their colors. Mackenzie and Keely know that in the face of death, panic will mean everybody dies. Staying calm is the only way they're going to save any lives. Their focus is as aerodynamic as the design of the planes they fly, pinpoint and level. The battle of their lives has just begun. At the rate they're falling, they have 8 minutes before they hit the ground. It takes 2 minutes for the backup generator to kick in. The engines are still dead, but now they have light, radio, and at least some hydraulic function. 6 minutes from the ground. Atlanta gets back in touch when the generator kicks in, and they already have the closest airstrip lined up for Mackenzie. Almost 20 miles away is Dobbins Air Reserve Base. They couldn't have asked for a better place to land. Dobbins is a military airport and one of the places where Keely did a lot of his training at. Keely takes over completely. His experience on this runway is their saving grace, and Mackenzie knows that handing over control is going to give them the best chance of survival. And even better, since it's military run, that means that it's fully equipped with emergency services. Atlanta calls it in, and the men and women manning Dobbins stream out onto the tarmac, standing at the ready. 4 minutes to the ground. At 2,100 meters from the ground, the DC-9 breaks out of the storm clouds. Finally, they can see in front of them. The hail stops abruptly, and the sunshine streams in through the window. The sudden silence is so jarring that it's almost as deafening as the hail. And the pilots are horrified to discover that they've lost more height than they thought they had. 1 minute and 30 seconds from the ground. They're still 19 miles away from Dobbins, and Keely realizes that they're not going to make it in time. Not with the altitude they have. Between Flight 242 and Dobbins are 2 small towns. Cartersville is 15 miles away, and New Hope is 10 miles off. New Hope has no airstrip, but Cartersville does. It's not the ideal place to land because the airstrip isn't exactly long enough to accommodate a DC-9, but it'll work in a pinch. But will that extra 5 miles be 5 miles too much? While Mackenzie desperately tries to get at least one engine going again, Keely tells Atlanta that we won't make it. There's just no way with this amount of altitude they've lost. So they've rerouted to the closest alternative, Cartersville. Don Foster gets a bright idea. He begins to stack every pillow and jacket around him for padding to offer at least some shield from a crash. Several other passengers take suit and begin to surround themselves with clothes, pillows, and any soft items they have at hand. 1 minute from the ground. 10 miles away from Cartersville, Keely makes the call. It's too far. They've lost too much altitude. Mackenzie suggests an open field, but Keely tells him no. Even though Mackenzie is technically the senior pilot here, he's given full command over to Keely, and with good reason. So when his suggestion is shut down, he offers no resistance. Keely has more combat flight experience, and he knows the area better. Fighting for command when the best man for the job is already in charge would be an idiotic move. Luckily, Keely and Mackenzie are not giving in to panic, and Mackenzie looks out of the cracked window. He points out Georgia State Highway 92. The highway runs through the closest town, New Hope, and it's almost empty. Most of the residents in the vicinity have been warned of approaching storms, and the inhabitants of Georgia know better than anyone just because the sun's out doesn't mean that won't change in the blink of an eye. A good storm can roll in mere seconds. Most families are in their basements, and the last of the stragglers are heading home to do the same. Keely called in. He was about to land a dead plane on a highway in the middle of Georgia without any previous training on landing an aircraft without engines. He was about to attempt the impossible. 30 seconds from the ground. Mackenzie calls in their decision to land on the highway. Even if Atlanta wanted to contest this, there wasn't any time to do that anyway. Keely turns without giving them a chance to react. It's all he can do. and hope and pray that he catches the tar at a straight angle at least. The fields whiz by the passengers' windows. They're now so close that they can make out the branches on the trees. The last impact the passengers hear before the crash is Sandy's voice shouting, "Brace for impact!" They put their heads down between their knees and brace themselves. Keely, going at 253 miles an hour, touches the wheels down surprisingly lightly. They bounce up and hit the tar again, this time harder. Again and again and again. They hit the ground, bounce up, and hit back down each time, with more force than the last. The second time they hit, they were inside the little town of New Hope. The third time they strike the tar, something explodes at the front end of the plane, killing Bill Mackenzie and Layman Keely instantly. The fourth time, the engines are dislodged in a fiery cascade, and the aircraft runs over a car. Inside that car is the Wilkerson family. Martha and James Wilkerson named all their kids with names starting with the letter J. The youngest was just a baby, and they all died in that instant as they were driving out of the grocery store parking lot to pick up some last-minute supplies before going down to their own basement. Attached to that grocery store was a gas station, and what little part of the plane that wasn't burned was instantly up in flames when the pumps exploded on impact. One more person on the ground named Ernest Pruitt, who was in close proximity to the gas pumps, died too. Don, who'd wrapped himself in a cocoon of padding, had only his hands exposed, holding his shield tight. He felt the rush of heat from the flames through the layers, and his hands were broiled as they went by. How many times they bounced is anyone's guess. Between the flames and the screams and the constant jolt of slamming into the earth over and over again, the people inside the plane just lost count. Flight 242 came to a standstill in front of Sadie Hurst's house. She and her two sons were down in the basement when they heard the explosions from up above. It was so intense that the windows rattled, and the earth beneath their feet shook like an earthquake. Sadie told her sons to stay put, and she ran up the stairs to her front door. When she opened that door, the heat from dozens of fires hit her face, and the horror scene in front of her came into focus. Between the burning debris of the aircraft and shards of buildings that were scattered down almost the entire length of the main street that ran through town, people started to emerge from the smoke. For a moment, the only sound came from the crackling of flames. They moved in almost complete silence towards Sadie's open door, like characters out of a doomsday movie. Nearly catatonic with shock, the only ones who were speaking were Catherine and Sandy. Remarkably, they were alive and relatively uninjured. Together, the two women, despite all that they'd already endured, were still in that forced state of calm. They herded everyone they could find toward the house. It was Catherine who found a passenger, Frederick Clemens, lying on someone's lawn. He'd been thrown from the craft and had burns on his hands and face. Don's makeshift cocoon saved his life, even though he was in one of the more damaged parts of the plane. He came back to his senses to find himself still strapped in his seat. His burned hands had trouble unclasping the safety belt, and when he finally got loose, he ran to the closest tier in the hull where sunshine was shining through. He dodged minor explosions before reaching the safety of the Hurst residence. Sadie Hurst thrust water into the survivors' hands and comforted them while Catherine tried to phone for help. When emergency services arrived, a lot of the help that came were the military personnel coming in from Carterville's airstrip, where they were standing by for an emergency landing already. The Hurst home turned into a makeshift hospital to treat the 22 passengers and the many injured who just happened to be in the path of the plane. All in all, 63 passengers perished in the crash, and 9 individuals on the ground died that day. 2 of those deaths occurred days after the crash, when the victims succumbed to their injuries. And now we move toward the investigation, but this isn't a run-of-the-mill case. It seems pretty straightforward. An aeroplane encountered impossible weather conditions, and the technology at the time wasn't appropriate to navigate them away from danger. This wasn't anyone's fault, was it? Well, the chances of both of a plane's engines giving out at the same time are statistically extremely low, and they flew straight at the storm, veering off their original path right into its heart. Had the pilots just kept going as they were planning to, none of this would have happened, and 72 people would still be alive today. Southern Airlines also had some answering to do. This was their second major crash in 7 years. The previous accident happened in 1970 when Flight 932, carrying an entire football team, flew straight into a hill and killed everyone on board in West Virginia. Was this somehow the airline's fault? Were their operators or pilots not sufficiently trained? Or was there something wrong with their aeroplanes altogether? In the end, it was determined that this was as a result of pilot error. Mackenzie and Keeley were aware of the radar restrictions. They'd received the training needed to spot misreadings, but the reading was difficult to accurately read. And in that lies the key word: difficult. The margin for human error using that radar is huge. They'd flown in storms before, and previously they didn't get any readings that were this far off. So there was no reason for them to discount the information on the screen now. So in our opinion, this was pilot error, but an understandable one given the extreme circumstances and the limited tech they had to work with. Air flight control are just as much responsible for this oversight as Keeley and Mackenzie were. Everyone relied too heavily on the radar, taking its readings at face value, when their training and experience in those volatile skies should have told them otherwise. The airline said that they should have asked for more assistance, but we'd like to argue that more assistance should have been offered too. Or maybe this is all just because nature, in its full ferocious glory, is an impossible foe to beat. The technology at the time just couldn't sufficiently read the conditions, and given the restrictions that weather stations had getting the information out manually without the use of satellites to track the progress of these storms. Honestly, the most surprising aspects of this case is that this wasn't a more common occurrence, and that anyone survived at all after falling from the sky and straight into a gas station. The pilots were further criticized for not communicating the situation with their flight attendants. Yet Catherine and Sandy's training gave them all the tools they needed to read the severity of the situation and to give the passengers in their care the best chance of survival. Keeley and Mackenzie did achieve a miracle on that day, despite what the airline tried to argue. If it weren't for them, every one of the souls on Flight 242 would have been dead, and probably more people in New Hope would have been gone too. They took the best and only option at their disposal at the time, knowing full well that they were at the front of the plane, putting them straight in the line of impact. Yet in their dying moments they tried, and to some degree succeeded, to save their passengers from the same fate that they knew awaited them on the highway. If it weren't for their military background and the years' worth of being exposed to stressful situations, well, let's just say that any other pilot would not have been able to get anyone out alive in those conditions. And those deaths were not for nothing. That crash resulted in the ill-equipped turbo engines to be redesigned to deal with unpredictable weather more efficiently, and a whole lot of research was put into improving standard radar equipment that's now in use on every major passenger aircraft in the world. It didn't happen overnight, but Flight 242's tragic fate went a long way to speed up the process. And finally, let's not forget about Catherine and Sandy, the two women who kept their cool and went back into the wreckage to get as many people out as they could. If today's case proves anything, it's that disasters like these made our time in the sky safer. All of those deaths, those families left with inconceivable loss, does have a silver lining. If it weren't for them, thousands more lives would have been lost since then. And it reminds us of the people next to us, and how even ordinary men and women can do remarkable things in terrible situations. Just like Sandy and Catherine were willing to put their passengers first, even if it meant dying themselves.